Next agenda item, we have Kimberly Clark, Administrator of Public Safety Communications for the City of Mesa. Thank you, Kimberly. And the presentation on the road to plain language.
Mark, thank you for having me today. So I'm going to start with the whole idea of plain language and not plain language. It came to me as a directive from my lieutenant in 2008. And it started early in Mesa and asking me questions like, how long do you think it would take us to translate to plain language? And I didn't know what he was talking about. I'm hopelessly optimistic. I said, a couple of months. Well, he took me up on that, and he gave me an extra month. The 1st of June, he gave me 90 days to transition Mesa Police and Fire Department and a fire agency support to plain language. So the first thing I did was say, what is plain language? And I went out and started my research, and I found that plain language is the removal of radio codes and pen codes in radio communication and replacing them with plain language. Well, that sounds really simple, but it's not. Then we had to look at how we would handle it as an agency, and our chief at the time determined that we would do plain language all the time. That means that we wouldn't use any radio code, pen code, or event codes in our agency in verbal communications or in written communications. And what that means is we couldn't say it over the phone or the radio. We couldn't say it in a message. We couldn't put it on case comments. It couldn't be anywhere. It was all plain language all the time. So the next question, whenever I started going out telling everyone, hey, guess what? We're going to plain language. It was, well, why? So I brought up the NIMS requirement at the time, and that was followed with, well, it says that you have to use it only in our agency. Why do we have to use it all the time? So, back to the research. And I found the Northern Virginia Common Language Interagency Work Group, and I spoke with Commander, at the time, Eddie Reitman, and Assistant Chief at Alexandria, Virginia. And he gave me these as what they used in their agency. So we adopted them. Under stress, we determined the day-to-day use is practical. Under stress, officers will revert to what's familiar to them. Plain language will be effective under stress when it becomes a habit. Successful transition to plain language requires use day-to-day. So that was my argument. And we did it. It took us about 96 days. Well, we went live at 65 days. I think very successfully. Since then, however, 18 months after we successfully transitioned to plain language, our chief determined, we have a new chief, and he determined that it would be acceptable to use plain language and code on Mesa Radio. So right now, on Mesa Radio, every day, you're getting your both. And we've transitioned back to this one. I was asked this year to talk at APCO in Houston regarding what we learned during that process. And so what I'm going to share with you today are the obstacles that we encountered and the solution that we implemented at the time. The first thing that I would think that everyone would need to understand when they're transitioning to plain language is to understand it's not simple. Just because it's plain doesn't mean that it's easy. Just because you speak in English every single day doesn't mean that it's going to be an easy thing to do. You have to figure out a way to buy in without selling out. Because whenever you consider code, especially in a law enforcement agency, that's at the heart of who your agency is. It's what sets you apart. So you have to figure out a way to mitigate that. And the last thing, and the most important, I think, is to fight fright. So that's what I'm going to do next. Plain is not simple. It sounds simple, but that can be very, very misleading. Many people thought transitioning to plain language was a no-brainer. We speak English every day. I think the best analogy that I have is an officer told me that speaking in uncoded language on the radio felt like saying the F word in front of his mother. It was wrong. You don't do that, right? You learn how to speak in code. You spend all this time dedicating yourself to that. And so once you know how to do it, that's what you should do all the time. So what we had to do was mitigate that problem. It required preparation and training. And I did manage to get that done in 90 days, although that was a pretty aggressive timeline. I think 6 months would probably be a better thing to be thinking of 6 months. What our solution was. We began with the end in mind. We really spent time thinking, what do we want it to sound like on the other end? We knew that we wanted to speak a clear message, that we wanted transmission to be concise, and that we needed to sound professional. So we had to really think about that going into it, assessing what our needs were and making adjustments as we respond. The next problem is how to buy in without selling out. And I mentioned this earlier. It's at the heart of your agency, your code. It's what makes you different from bad guys, and it's what makes you different from other law enforcement agencies, and it's what makes fire different from police. It's what sets you apart. And so whenever you're thinking about changing that, you have to really understand the emotionality that is tied to those codes. And what I found was it was job specific. So a motor really wanted to keep the code 910, which was the code for a transport, because that's how he would brag on the radio that he made. A warrant officer really wanted to keep the code 1038, because it was what was close to him. A day shift patrol officer really wanted to keep the code, I'll be code 7 at my 1042, meaning I'll be at lunch at home. But a graveyard patrol officer really wanted to keep the code 1015, meaning I just arrested this guy or arrested that guy. So what I found as I went out and talked to stakeholders was they had their own personal agenda related to all of these various codes. So what did we do? We tried to find a way to allow them to retain their identity. And I had a really heated discussion one day with the motor, and I remember saying, but why can't you just say transport? It's the same thing. And they did do that. They did do that. But we also learned that a whole new vernacular came out. In Mesa, we use the term code 4 for are you okay? Most ESL agencies do, most agencies in Arizona do, but Apache Junction doesn't. They use a different code, and they're right there with us, right? So whenever we started talking about taking away the term code 4, people really got upset. I joke around with officers in our agency. I said on ride-alongs, and you'll roll by a traffic stop and you'll see an officer go like this, or he'll do this. I tell him that's the police gang sign. He's saying, I'm secure, you can go on, okay? So there's a whole lot tied up in that code 4. So what did we had to identify a new way of saying that. And my lieutenant at the time said, ask me for secure. Okay, you're telling me to ask men over the radio if they're secure. That's not going to go very well, but actually it did. What we would say is please secure, or a status check. We found that there were different phrases that came into play in place of code 4. To this day, you can still hear officers on Mesa radio saying, I'm secure, is he secure, are you secure? They'll answer affirmatively. So what we did was find replacement phrases that maintained that same value to them, but we had to do it carefully. And then we also took on the things that they developed themselves. We also had to go back and look at what's working and what isn't working. One of the first complications that we found was on the inquiry channel. If you ask for a 27, 28, 29, in law enforcement, you're asking for a license check, a wants check, a driver's license registration check, and a wanted visa check. That's a whole lot of words to say, right? So what do? So then officers would go on to inquiry and they'd ask for a license check. And we'd have to ask for clarification. Do you want the person or the car? What is it that you want? So we developed these phrases that would fit those needs. So we replaced 1027, 1028, 1029 with a person and vehicle check. Or if you just wanted the person check, you would say the person check. And we would run the person for warrants and for their driver's license. The same with the vehicle. So as those things came up, we identified mitigation strategies, and then we marketed them back out and made sure that everyone was clear on these things. This was the biggest one for me, fear. Whenever I'm very optimistic and I'm running out saying, guess what, we're changing to plain language. And I was really surprised when people about ripped my head off. They were very, very aggressive. And at first it was sort of blowback and you don't want to run and hide. But then you realize, they're really smart people. Maybe I should listen to them. And so what I would find myself is if someone really felt emotionally connected code and they did not want to make this transition, I would seek them out. And I would engage them in dialogue, and I would find out what their fears were. Talk to them, be open, get their questions, find out what their challenges are, and then go back and develop mitigation strategies to address those things. You never know. They might be right. They were in a couple of situations. one of the things that, there were three primary things people would complain about. The first thing they would say is bad officer safety. Well, you can stream radio on an iPhone app right now. So, you know, they hear you talking everywhere, right? So we should speak in code. Well, we had all of our codes up on the internet. So we weren't protecting that information. We were sharing with everyone, and then we were thinking that we were super secret. And I personally think there's more risk for you thinking that you're safe when you're not than really being careful because you need to be. I remember a warrant officer during this process. I went to him specifically because he's known to be pretty stubborn, and I thought he would tell me what he really thought. And I said, are you afraid you say the guy's got a warrant? He goes, no, he knows he's got a warrant. I know he's got a warrant. He's going to comply or he's going to run. That's always what I'm dealing with, and that's how I should engage every one of those situations. So he helped me to feel better about that one, but there were still others. Another one was, it's going to take more airtime. Okay, that sounds legitimate to me. So I tasked someone with counting syllables. And we did hours and hours of radio tape, and we counted syllables using codes, and then we replaced the coded language with words, and we did a comparison syllable count. And we found that using real words with less syllables than using code in many situations, on scene, syllables, 1097. What we found was that it wasn't the words you were using, it was the fact you were using way too many words. So in one of the transmissions that we analyzed, it was something like, North 7, show me 10A, back on channel 2, send me the next one. And I don't remember the number now, it was something like 28 or 30 syllables. Where if she had just said, North 7, available on 2, the next one, it was the fewer syllables that she would have said. But really what she should have said is, I'm available. The dispatcher knows what to do next. You don't need to tell her. So we identified that the problem wasn't the words that you were saying. It was the fact that you were saying too many of them. It didn't matter if it was code or plain language, or you were just talking too much. So really, it's radio discipline now that's helping there. Well, the next thing that they came up with in our agency was, you know, it's going to take us a lot longer to type all of those words than it does a code. So a crazy person. We use the radio code 918 in Mesa to indicate that someone is insane. But we use that same radio code as a verb, an adverb, a noun. You know, somebody can be 918, they can go 918, the situation can be 918. You know, you really have to think about that. And so the 911 officers were saying it's going to take me longer to type words than it is going to be to type code. So I challenged them. And we did this plain challenge, and I challenged everyone in our communication center to come up with alternatives, and they did. We had hundreds, if not thousands, of things submitted. And we identified the winning shift and made out a pizza party, and then many other people got star awards for different things. But we challenged them, you know. If you think that's going to be a problem, then let's figure it out. Oh, I forgot this part. We did do a keystroke count, just like we did a syllable count, and we found it would take us 10% longer to enter an e-call in our agency using typewritten words than it would use this. So through the challenge, they came up with their own mitigation strategies, and that's whenever we really started getting buy-in. And that's when we could go to those people who were the naysayers, who were saying, this isn't going to work. And we could say, yeah, you're right. We found that you were right. It wasn't going to work if we did it that way. So we've implemented this mitigation strategy, and I think with your help, we can make it work. And that's when we started seeing things happen. I had a 90-day timeline. We actually went live on day 65. And the reason we did that was because the people wanted to. They've been invested in this thing now, and they're tired of listening to me for 2 months. They're saying, well, can't we just do it? Sure. Go ahead. If you want to do it, go ahead. And the coolest thing happened. By letting communications lead, the officers, they just said whatever the dispatcher said, they just repeated it back. So we ended up with a really great synergistic movement in Mesa. The 911 operators typed words instead of codes. The dispatchers said words instead of codes. The officers repeated back what the dispatcher said, and it was really successful. We had a live cut date on September 8th, 2008, and for the first 30 days after that, we rewarded success, everyone to anyone. And I made these little, we didn't have any money, so I made challenge points, but they were just handmade within our agency, some people helped me with it. And when somebody, it said on the one side, riding the plane train, on the other side it said, challenge accepted. And so when somebody worked they worked a homicide and they didn't use any code, we would give them one of those. And then they kept them, cashed them in and gave them Star Awards. And sometimes they would rip a corner off saying, well, you did that for pursuit, but you did use one code, here you go, you almost got it. It was pretty neat to see how they did it, but it was dispatcher to officer, 911 officer to dispatcher. It wasn't administration to anyone. It then became a grassroots effort on their part, and they were really proud of themselves. And I remember thinking it was success. In November, I was graveyard administrator at the time, and I was on my way out at 3 a.m. and the dispatcher, got to her channel, and announced foot pursuit. And I stood there next to her, and she's working this whole foot pursuit, and we're in it maybe 5, 6, 8 minutes, I don't know. And I'm smiling. And she's like, why are you smiling? And I said, because you haven't used any code. She goes, sometimes it's easier to say what you mean. And that was when I was like, we've done it. We're finally there. On any good trip, one of the passengers was going to ask this question, are we there yet? Well, we still use code in Mesa, and we still use plain language in Mesa. Every day, all day. One person, it was interesting, when we were strictly plain language, you would hear a dispatcher use a code, and then an officer use a code, and it was like a slippery slope. They would just slide in a free fall until somebody read it. Oops, wait a minute, we got to go back to plain language. And now it's acceptable to do either. Now that the pressure's off, I really hear much more plain language on the air than I do code, and that's a good thing. That's acceptable. I'll take that. I'll take that as a win. But here's what's more important. We've been doing some really cool things in the East Valley. Since the shoe handler incident, we've really tried to go back and assess our interoperability. How can we talk with other agencies? What works, what doesn't work, what can we do better? And we've implemented in the last few months a couple of different mechanisms to patch to other channels. One we refer to as facilitated patch, where we go through Tempe. As a gateway agency, they can connect pretty much to anybody. Secondly, though, we've recently went online with a directed patch between us and Gilbert and Apache Junction. And on September 25th, we had a trial version of this radio configuration deployed on a console in our communication center. And they had a homicide in Gilbert. And Gilbert dispatcher called and said, it was right on the border. We were getting calls on it too. The Mesa officers were responding and Gilbert officers were responding. Gilbert supervisor called over and said, how do we get on the same channel? How do we do this? And the supervisor said, hey, we have this test configuration loaded up. I can probably do that for you. We patched our hot channel to their hot channel. We went into an agreement that we had already agreed on, where there was primary dispatcher and secondary dispatcher. It was fabulous. There was an issue with code. Even Mesa officers were using code. And the lieutenant on scene got on the air and said, all you just remember to use plain language. Well, the difference is Mesa officers know how to do it because we've been doing it for the last 2 years. And in that heated situation, they're not struck with, what do I say now? What's the word for that? You say fire to a police officer, what does it mean? You say fire to a firefighter, and he's going to get a hose. It's 2 different things. And you may think that you know what you mean, but maybe you're not saying it clearly, or maybe there's a different vernacular within your agency. So I would say that we're there, but we're not there completely yet. The way that technology is working right now, we have the ability to talk on shared frequencies. We have the ability to patch our channels to their channels. We have the ability to do that. We're having the need to come up more and more. 2 days after the homicide, we had another situation. The car jacking in Mesa. The car fled Mesa. It traveled into Chandler. They tried to ram 2 officers. It went into Tempe. We did a facilitated patch between Mesa, Chandler, and Tempe. It was set up very quickly. It was amazing. But again, the issue was plain language. Plain language. There it is. So my question is, if the next step is interoperability, if we have the technology to allow us to communicate frequently, we can do it. We have the need because our borders are right next to each other, and it's easy to have a felony finally one sitting going to the next. When do we go from interoperability to just becoming normal operability? Right? And so what I would say to my partner agencies is join us on the journey. You know, plain language, it's not like you flip a light switch and all of a sudden you do it differently. There's a process that you go through. But we've made that transition, I think we do it well, we still use code, but it's okay. When we're on those situations that are critical, Mesa officers know how to use things.